founder of Bean, which is the Business Exit Advisors. And today he's going to talk about not only being a business advisor, but he's also going to talk about the value of a CFO and particularly the value to a small business for a fractional CFO. So, if we can start, Jeffrey, if you can just start by introducing yourself, give us a little bit of a background on who Jeffrey is.
Who Jeffrey is. Well, first of all, thanks, Lori. Thanks for organizing this and welcome everybody. I'm really happy that you've decided to join us for the next hour or so. Yeah, my name is Jeff Cullen, and I am the founder of the Cullen Projects Group and the Basecamp 4 Management Development Program, and a senior accredited business broker with Sunbelt Business Brokers, starting my career many, many years ago in engineering and then kind of transitioning to management consulting after doing my MBA and having worked for almost exclusively private sector companies over many, many years as a consultant till I joined Sunbelt about coming up on 3 years ago as a broker. So, I was saying to Lori, really, at the end of the day, I think what I try to focus on in all of those different roles is value creation and helping organizations to create, unlock, and then ultimately harvest the value that they build in their companies, because obviously they put a lot of time and sweat and stress and everything into it. So how can we help them maximize that value and then ultimately, like I say, get it out and put it in their pocket at the end of the day?
That's what we all want. Isn't that why we're all in business? Tell me a little bit about, and it seems so obvious, a chief financial officer and a CFO, but really, what is a CFO and how does a CFO work within the organization? I know I'm getting ahead of myself. We have a more specific question coming up on that, but the general highlights of a CFO.
Yeah, so I see a CFO as obviously a member of the management team, typically working directly with the owner or the CEO if it's a larger organization. And the role is really one of, well, my old partner used to say, making the beans count as opposed to counting the beans, right? And we're going to talk in a minute about where that fits in with the other professionals. But it's really, again, about helping an organization transition from kind of that early stage where everything is informal and typically the management team, or even if it's a single owner, they have their pulse, their finger on the pulse of everything. And as the company begins to become larger, more successful, and more complex, they begin to run into some roadblocks. And typically, one of the big ones is poor command of the financials, at a deeper level to help understand how the business works, the mechanics of the business in terms of creating profit, creating value. And so a CFO is someone who can kind of parse that. And then, so there's a role, I guess, in determining what's going on, but then inputting into better decision making and allowing the organization to execute on their goals. Because how many organizations, many owners I've worked with, have definitive goals, plans, and yet those will always seem to remain not on the back burner, but unrealized because they lack a certain amount of internal resources. So the CFO role is one of those resources.
Member on the team, and tell me where a CFO fits with regards to a company's accountant or bookkeeping services. So how does the CFO work with the dynamics that are already in place on the financial side?
Yeah, great question. Because obviously owners wonder about that, right? They already have a bookkeeper, they're paying an external accountant. So there's a gentleman who posts on LinkedIn. I really like his stuff. He runs a family office in London in the UK. And just recently he had a post on the need for a CFO. And the way he said it was, your bookkeeper records the past, the accountant reports on the past, and then the CFO helps to create the future. Because again, many organizations, business owners that I've worked with at the mid-size, the story is, and certainly not to disparage accountants, because an external accountant has a very definitive role. They create value in their lane. But a lot of owners will say, I sat down with my accountant several months after year end, and it's almost like a little bit of a gender reveal party. There's a drum roll, and then it's like, ta-da! We were profitable last year, or if it's a good year, or the next year it may be not so profitable, or even there's a loss, and they don't seem to have that innate understanding of the why. Well, what changed? And often when conditions change, and I think we're really prone to this in Alberta, when times are good, companies make great profit without really understanding why. And then when things change, sometimes they run into challenges. And again, they don't have that deep understanding. And that's not the accountant's job, right? Your external accountant's job is to create financial reports and help with tax and those things. So the CFO is that on the team player that's going to dive into those things and answer those questions and then predict what's likely going to happen.
Well, that brings to mind two things. One, I always think about, and again, not to disparage accountants, we all need an accountant. I love my accountant, and they know, just like a priest, they know a lot more than perhaps my priest does. But I think about an accountant is more of a rear window. It's like looking in the rear view mirror to see where I've been down the road, whereas what you're explaining to me looks like I'm looking out of the windshield. I want to see going forward. And I've done it as well. Perhaps we sometimes look to our accountant for those services that the a typical accountant is just not prepared to provide. That's not part of their job structure. It's not part of their thinking. So I do think that looking at a CFO's position is somebody who's going to help you navigate like a GPS down the road that you actually want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great analogy. Looking out the windshield and also looking at the dashboard, right? Because that's again something that a CFO will do is get into those metrics, whether they be lead metrics or lag metrics, and again help understand on a day-to-day basis, what should everybody in the organization be stewarding to get to the result? Because again, lots of people have goals, and we're here now and we want to get to somewhere, and it's that roadmap of, okay, well, how do we get there? What do we actually have to do, and how are we going to measure if we're making progress, and what are we going to measure, right? What's relevant, what's not. So that's part of it as well. But yeah, so
Well, you can't track what you don't measure. And there in business, a lot of things are not nebulous. And if you're making decisions based on nebulous thoughts, patterns, or hopes, as they sometimes say, we're not going to get very far. But why fractional? What's the advantage of a fractional CFO versus just throwing somebody right on the team as on a full-time teammate?
yeah, great question. So the way I see it, it's a matter of cost effectiveness and when an organization can start to use those skills and those resources. So typically, small startup, I'm going to say up until about $1 million in revenue, probably can't really afford even a fractional CFO, and typically don't necessarily need one. I mean, that's a generalization. Again, because the company at that point is still the owner kind of has a lot of control, a lot of that knowledge, maybe instinctively. Um, when a company hits about 5 million, again, just general rule of thumb, at that point they're probably in a position where they would want to bring in a permanent CFO. So it's that bridge between 1 million and 5 million, roughly, where you start to be able to say, we could definitely use that knowledge, that formality, that guidelines for decision making, that information. And yeah, we can't afford to necessarily bring somebody on full time. But maybe we can afford to have someone come in, a day a week or 2 days a week, or depending on, what the needs are in their growth trajectory. So that's why fractional. It's that bridging between we don't need one yet to we need one full time, but we can't afford it in the interim.
And that brings to mind that you're working on a specific time period. You're coming into a business with the expectation that you're actually going to exit that business at some point in time. How do you measure, how do you lay out what success or failure looks like on when you're coming in and what things look like and when is a good time for me to leave?
Right, right, exactly. Good, great question. So yeah, the way I've worked in the past, it all depends on their situation. So I've come in where really they're in trouble. There's things that are critical that need to be addressed. So we would identify that as the scope and the main focus with a reasonable timeline. It might be 3 months or 6 months. Um, very definitive, observable, and measurable metrics. And the question I always ask is how do we know we're being successful? How do we know that this is giving us, what we need? If an organization is not necessarily in crisis, but then they want to move beyond, let's say, a plateau or being stuck, again, that might be a longer term engagement. But again, same idea of, okay, well, what is the specific goal that we want to achieve, and how are we going to measure that, let's say every 3 months, or again, depends what the owner wants, but a regular cycle of checking in and saying, breaking it down. Okay, if we want to achieve this 18 months from now, where do we need to be 12 months from now, 9 months from now, 6 months from now? So again, I like to have a lot of clarity, with the engagement, so we can sit down and really with the owner or the management team and say, here's what we said we were going to do. Here's what we've done so far. Are we ahead, behind? And are we still heading in the right direction? And then even necessarily sometimes revisit that end goal because, situations change. The market might shift, opportunities come up. So it's both dynamic and I guess specific at the same time.
It makes me think about the many hats we wear as business owners. And sometimes we'll wear that CFO hat and we think we don't need it. And is there a bit of a misconception that sometimes you would only bring in a CFO or even a fractional CFO if you're actually thinking in growth mode? And then you think, well, I got to get my stuff together before I consider having
Mm.
a fractional CFO. Or is it only for growth minded companies to consider, or are there other areas where a CFO is actually going to be a good fit within that company?
Uh, Again, it depends. I don't think it's only focused on growth mode because some organizations are not positioned to grow. Um, they may want to grow or they're going to attempt to grow, and it's pretty classic sometimes that organizations will make a leap without necessarily having the infrastructure. So a great example, real world example, I was working for a client years ago through the BDC, and they were a manufacturing business, and they'd invested significantly in a lot of production equipment. In fact, part of what we were doing is they wanted a loan for that one last piece of equipment that would allow them to automate, most of the process, material handling, all of that. It was really quite impressive. And the CEO's goal was to double their revenue. And they'd looked at the market and they realized that it was probably achievable. What they had looked at though was, and what I was able to dig into was, how are you guys managing projects? And turns out it was pretty archaic, clipboard and paper, and the project manager basically saying when a client phones and asks where their project is, I literally have to physically get up, go downstairs, walk around the floor, find out who's working on this thing, and get them a status report. And it might take me hours or even days to get back to this client. In our day, that doesn't necessarily demonstrate a lot of confidence. And in fact, at one point they found an order that they thought they'd shipped months ago, and it was sitting somewhere in the warehouse, and they realized, oh my God, we never shipped this thing. And by the time they phoned the client was like, thanks, we don't want it anymore, right? So, doubling capacity. And then the other part, bottleneck, if you will, is that they were basically sending out something like 13,000 invoices a year, and his wife was the office manager, and he had no plans to look at how do we, streamline the administrative side of it. And so when I asked her if she thought she could handle 26,000 invoices, she basically slapped him, called him a fool and said, that's not going to happen. So you have to look at all of the parts, right? Like a goal can be great, but does the market support it? Does our infrastructure support it? What are going to be the requirements? And will we be able to do that leap? Because another really common thing sometimes, if it's a fixed cost, someone will hire a salesperson, for instance, and of course they want to be paid, if it's not commission, but it might take 12, 18 months before the results of hiring that position start to show up on the bottom line, and can the company bridge that gap of time? And sometimes they can't, right? So yeah, growth is important, but it's what's the springboard that we're growing from? Are we positioned internally, externally? And again, fractional CFO can look at kind of that stuff and look at like all of the levers, and I like to call them the cogs, and figure out, yeah, we have the capacity to actually do that now, deliberately and carefully.
What I'm hearing is when it comes to considering whether a CFO or a fractional CFO may fit, you're you're the bridge, absolutely, but it seems to me that you're answering those questions of why are we doing this
Right.
and how are we going to get there based on the current metrics and our foreseeable metrics that we want to achieve. Am I correct in making that assumption?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So when we talk about value and adding in a CFO, many times I mean, I'm no different than anybody else. I'm thinking about expenses on the sheet. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
do I want just one more expense? Is it going to be worthwhile? What's my return on investment? Typically, what's the value that a CFO is really going to pull into a corporation?
Great question. And I mean, it's hard to put a specific number on it, but I think we can define the value in a couple of ways. So again, I'll put on my exit planning and business broker hat for a second. Um, Value can be extracted basically at two position or two times in the organization while it's still operating, day to day, and ultimately when the owner is ready to exit. So the better the organization is operating, obviously the more profitable it is. It has the opportunity to grow. So and again, grow sustainably, grow profitably. Yeah, that's another big problem, right? Sometimes people grow themselves out of profitability. What have you gained? So to grow profitability profitably and then put more to the bottom line obviously creates value in those years, year upon year. And then when the business is ready to be transitioned either internally or sold externally, then a buyer is going to see, they're buying something that has a growth trajectory, that is a mature business, that operates predictably, that has systems in place. And again, that's going to translate to value, real value, sometimes significant value at both those times. So, and then the other value sometimes is avoiding bad mistakes. Like I'd say, that leap to growth that is probably a little bit out of reach, given where the organization is currently, can be very detrimental. So the CFO can help. Again, not necessarily their job to make the decisions, but to inform the decisions and look at all of those aspects, internal, external strategy, choices, and say, yeah, maybe we should do this, but maybe here's some steps, or here's some pitfalls that we need to kind of identify and maybe mitigate. So yeah, lots of ways to create value. As for a specific number, again, when I do an engagement, if we can come up with a target that again ties to that milestones, I like to do that. In some cases, it's a little bit harder to do because the picture's not as clear. And then in other cases, it's a bit easier, and we can go ahead and do that. What do we think we can achieve, and are we moving towards it?
And I like that answer because it has to be case by case basis. I think sometimes too what we face as business owners, as entrepreneurs, and the fact that we are wearing many hats is when do we invest in our company to bring on a fractional CFO? And we've talked about this before about the misguided approach of expecting a hockey stick, right? That it's just going to be a check mark
Right.
and off we go. And when really what it is you're dipping below the surface in that investment in order to get that steeper climb on the other side to have somebody like you come in, understand those numbers, and then move forward with it. How do you overcome some of those barriers that business owners may have to bringing in a fractional CFO? What's the conversation look like?
Yeah, very good question. I think it starts with a conversation about their goals and outcomes. And it's typical for consultants, right? Which a CFO is more of a consultant in the car as opposed to external. It's the pain points. Like, what is it that is uh, um, causing any kind of concern? And that could be, like I say, a a serious risk to the business that they're aware of. And I'll tell a story in a minute to give an example. Or it could be more commonly, let's call them unresolved or unmet desires. There's this continuous desire to move past a certain point, and the organization just seems to be stuck, and they just don't seem to be able to get past it. And they don't really know why. Or they've got to a certain point now where maybe their performance is actually beginning to decrease, right? So again, they're starting to see those elements of not as profitable as they were, and nobody wants to be working harder and doing more and not putting as much to the bottom line as they were a year ago when they were doing less, right? And that's not uncommon, and that's usually a pretty big red flag that we have to figure out why that is. So
Well, we talked a little bit before. I mean, we've known each other for quite a long time, and sometimes people are in business and the business is going along tickety-boo. They've got a lot of reoccurring revenue. They've got a good client stream, but they can't seem to get that traction. There's a misalignment of the team. They actually don't know where they're going. And I know you've had some experience where you just have to dig into all aspects of the operations and to see what's going out the door, how it's going out the door, and why isn't this being tracked, measured, and followed.
yeah, that's absolutely right. So I think I've shared that story with you. So I was brought in again as a BDC consultant to do a short term, it was probably about 4 months stint it wasn't officially as a CFO, but that basically was the role that I was fulfilling. And it was a company that had been around for a long time. They were third generation and fourth generation in the organization. So hoping to transition to the fourth generation. So coming up on almost a century in business. And they were fab shop, pretty straightforward business, very successful over many, many years. And what had happened is the fourth generation guys had convinced the parents basically to take a leap, and they borrowed a significant sum of money, like $20 million, with the intention of developing a new building, developing an industrial park that they would basically be able to resell those lots. And it was a great idea on paper. And of course, the bank more than willing to to lend them money. But we had one of our major economic downturns, and what happened is that they were suddenly in a position where the bank was putting a lot of pressure on them. In fact, I sat in a 3 hour meeting. The bank guy flew in from Toronto and basically threatened them for 3 hours with we take the business, we take the land, we take your homes, we take it all, right? The problem is that they didn't have a plan. And so once the bank left and things calmed down, we realized that if we could come up with a recovery plan, and it was a classic, right? They've been in business a long time. The CFO, who was the mom, basically said, I know we're losing money somewhere, but I just don't know where. And when we looked at their financials, it was, one big line for revenue, one big line for costs, even though they had numerous business lines and many, many projects. They had no information on what's profitable, what's not profitable. Where is this leak? So we literally sat down over a weekend at their kitchen table and went over something like, I can't remember, 24 months worth of purchase orders, invoices, labor reports, and I basically created a cost analysis. And what we determined was, first of all, there was this big machine that the father, the dad, the CEO was in love with. He kept saying, if we just get volume up on that thing, we'll be fine. When I looked at it, turns out we were losing like 30 cents on the dollar. So the answer was not more volume. It was we either got to change how we're operating that. It was in a separate building. There wasn't enough power. He was running a generator to run this thing. It was like, this is nuts. So it was like, you got to change how you're doing this or you got to shut it down. The other thing I found is that they had a combination of larger projects, which the sons had started moving the company into, let's do some big fab projects and still doing the smaller stuff. And they kept pulling people off the big projects. Some guy comes in with a lawn chair for $80 and they're pulling a guy off the big project for 4 hours and doing that constantly. So that wasn't profitable. And then ultimately, what had really saved them over the years was material sales had these huge margins. And again, the market had shifted and now they were not making as much. And so that had been masking these losses, and as we sat there, she looked at me and she said, oh my God, how much money, I mean, how much profit have we lost over the years when we were doing okay? if we had been profitable in those areas that we're losing and we'd had this profit, you know? So at
Right.
the end of the day, what we were able to do was present a recovery plan. The bank guy came back in, we sat them down, went through it. And because they could answer, here's what we're planning on doing. We're shutting this down, we're changing that. The bank eased off, gave them 24 months to just do interest only, which they were able to work themselves out of it. And then ultimately, we then moved on to an exit and transition project with them. So, what's the value of losing a 100-year-old business? Um, a lot, right?
Well, there's legacy, right? There's no, it's not just about the dollars and cents. It's about the value, it's about the legacy. Do you find a lot of times, especially in the manufacturing, and not to put a pin on manufacturing, but is there a huge education component as well to understand that cash conversion cycle? You know, how long are we going to wait before we put out our manufacturing costs? Distribute it to the marketplace before we get our cash back on that, and how to close that loop, make it a little bit tighter. Do you find that that is a common area?
Yeah, not only in manufacturing though. I've also seen it pretty commonly in professional service firms that are project based, right? So yeah, that the cycle is poorly understood. Obviously, another thing that we often look at is the cash flow as well, right? Because again, something can come in, and I mean this is where the profit that shows up on the bookkeeper or the balance sheet, or sorry, the P&L can be deceptive, right? How many companies you seem to be profitable on paper, and yet we're running out of money. So again, yeah, understanding that cycle of the cash flow through the project. And this is another common thing sometimes with construction companies where they'll get that big project. They've been doing well for a number of years, at a certain level of project size, and all of a sudden a client offers them that big whale and they think, man, this is going to be fantastic. And then they take it on and then they realize, for instance, sometimes that their bank, because they don't have a track record, they come and say, well, we need to increase our line of credit because now we have to buy a bunch of material for this 3 times bigger than we've ever done project. And the bank says, well, you don't have a track record for that. So we'll increase it, a little bit, but maybe not to what the level that you want. So again, yeah, all of that, I call it the mechanics of it, right? Like how does the profit actually get created? And without digging into that. And then, once you've done that, then what you have is a model which you can then use for future prediction, a what if analysis. Okay, well, now we understand how the mechanics work. What if we change this? What if we improve that? And so that's a tool I typically will deliver at the end, if even if I'm exiting. So now we've got the tool in place to do that cost analysis, the pricing analysis, a little bit of what if analysis, and now you're not flying blind till
Well, and
things change and then I have to come back to update it, right? And that's how it goes.
systems and processes, it always comes down to systems and processes. For you as a fractional CFO and a business broker, what would define success for you when you're working with a company? So outside of the company can walk away and say, you know what, we are so very glad that we've had a CFO come in. Now we understand where the business is going. But what does success look like to you in the role that you play within the companies?
Yeah, not getting fired.
That would be
That's
a good one.
that's happened a few times where you just butt heads and the owner is like, I don't want to do what you're doing or what you're suggesting. So not getting fired is definitely part of it. And that's navigating that relationship. But typically it's again, it comes back to what we talked about at the beginning. Did we have a set objective that we wanted to achieve? And that could be both quantitative, or sometimes it's just like we are so stressed out because we don't know what we're doing, and it's just not, we're miserable. We're not having fun in the business. We've grown a little bit too much, and we want out. So again, if putting the processes and systems, getting the management team to be more, on the same page, because often there might be internal conflict. Marketing or sales and operations is classic, right? Making promises on what can be delivered when there's really no understanding of, well, what is the capacity of the production side of it? How much can we actually produce? And that, can we steward our sales to that? So if we achieve those goals, like I said, qualitative and quantitative, and they feel like they're okay now to either bring on a full-time CFO because we've seen the growth, or they're like, you know what, we're good. We're going to plateau now for a while. We've stabilized things. Let's just chug away for a while until we're ready to make the next leap. That to me is success. And then, obviously a good referral.
Well, and the owner too has to be open to accept that advice and that counsel and move forward. It makes me think about going to the doctor, and the doctor can say, "Well, you need to cut back on that salt." And I go, "Yeah, but then I'm going to cut back on the flavor." You know what I'm saying? So
Right.
so the person has to be willing to, as you said, not getting fired, but I think that comes to that. Are they ready? Is now the right time for them? Which brings us to that, if we know that having you in the company is going to help us understand, measure, and work toward our why and how to get there, from the owner's perspective, when is the right time to pull in a CFO?
Yeah, good question. Anytime is a good time to pull in a CFO. No, like I said, I think there's a certain life cycle or growth cycle to organizations, and there's actually a really good model for that. But so typically when companies start, if they're successful. I mean, the idea just doesn't work and doesn't go anywhere. But those companies that hit, right, have this rapid growth. That's probably not the best time for a CFO, just because everything is focused on growing market share, learning, and you almost want that the CEO to be entirely in control, and they don't really necessarily need a lot of input because things are just taking off, and they call that the go stage, right? But typically what happens is that begins to start to flatten out. And again, it's tied to that complexity where now suddenly they've had to hire more people. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens around that, right? On the HR side, and how do we communicate the mission or what the hell the purpose of the organization is. But on the financial management side, it just becomes a little bit more complicated. They start to lose the ability to know every single project. I had a client one time, we're sitting in his office, the first meeting. I think he was interrupted about 15 times in an hour, including honestly somebody coming in to ask if they should water the plants. And I was like, really, Dave? His name was Dave. You know, I think you need to delegate that, right? But what he said was, and he'd been very successful. They'd been bought out by an American company because they had grown. And he's like, when we were at like 5 million, I knew every single project and every job in the shop. So when guys would come in and ask me what they should do, I could immediately answer. Now I got to ask them 10 questions before I can figure out what to tell them, right? So, that's indicative of that position where we need data, we need process, we need to understand, what the mechanics of the business are so that certainly not the owner having to answer everything flying blind, right? There's too much complexity at that point. So that's a good point. And then the other point is again, if they've been plateaued for a long time and now they want to hit that next growth curve, or it's starting to dip, either because of fatigue or like I say, they've just made slightly too much of a stretch, that would be another good time to bring in somebody to at least have a look and evaluate. Are we operating average, below average, top of class? What are some of and it's always 80/20, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to fix everything. It's figuring out there's probably 20% of the things that you're doing that are causing 80% of the challenges. And if we can figure those out and fix it, that's going to be a huge bump right off the bat.
What I'm hearing is that it's okay to, words are words until you put them into practice. So for instance, okay to tell everybody that they need to delegate. You need to delegate, you need to do that. But if you don't know what to delegate or how to delegate or why you're delegating, then it turns into a bit of a porridge, right? I don't know what I'm doing, right? If I and those are the same with all kinds of other questions that we have in business on a daily basis. There were a couple of things came across my desk this morning that completely distract you from the work at hand because you're like, well, where did that come from? It blindsides you out of the blue. And I think that happens to everybody in business.
Mhm.
As I open it up to our participants, thank you so much for coming in today and listening to Jeffrey and I have a conversation. Think about the questions that you would like to ask Jeffrey. You can either raise your hand or you can throw them in the chat bar if that is more comfortable. But Jeffrey, just as we open it up to the room, what's a question that I haven't asked you that you would like to answer?
Oh, wow. This is a bit of a curveball.
Hadn't prepared you for that one.
No, that's right. Um, I think maybe it's this idea of the value creation cycle, and we can just talk. I'll put on my broker hat a little bit, my exit planner hat. Again, the fractional CFO experience, if I can call it that, I think again ties to later down the road a more successful and lucrative exit. Because again, and it's like I said, the things that you do to make the business better today pay dividends in the short term, right? Because you're operating at better growth, better profitability, less stress. And then they really pay dividends at the end of the day. So that's another metric sometimes that we can use is to do a high level valuation and say, okay, if you had to sell the business today, if there was some adverse event, right? Because again, none of us are guaranteed, that life will continue. Like they say, porridge happens, right? If you had to exit today, what would the business be worth on the market? And that becomes another way of measuring a metric. Say, well, so again, the same things that are going to drive the profitability, they're going to make your life easier, have a better understanding, better decision making, better delegation, better control are going to impact that value. So in let's say 6 months or a year, let's redo that exercise and see, and that maybe is the best or one of the most easily understood metrics, right? Because it's a lag metric. It's very comprehensive because it looks at all of those parts. It's not only profitability, that's one part of it, growth, stability, predictability, strength of the management team, customer concentration, all the stuff that makes the business better drives that value. So it's a really good way of just doing a bit of a gut check. Have we increased that number over the last 18 or 12 months or whatever the term is? I won't say 3 months because that's usually too short to move the needle, but yeah, it
Well, and it takes time, right? Like it takes time to
does take
move
time.
the needle. But there is, it is the next guarantee when you are in business, it is guaranteed that that business will change hands. It will either change hands by successfully transitioning to another entity, be that family, private equity, or another owner, or it'll change hands where it'll just fall into nothingness. And the decision is ours and comes down to that planning, right? Like how have we planned for those such events? But let's open it up and see if anybody has questions. I don't see anything in the chat right now, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a shy bunch of people.
I'm happy to go first.
All right, you go ahead.
Hey, Sarah, how are you?
I'm good. You?
I'm
I'm getting
excellent.
I'm getting lots out of this. This is amazing.
Okay.
So bookkeeping standpoint,
Yeah,
so I work with a lot of smalls and kind of coming up to not smalls anymore, right?
yeah.
And a lot of them are service-based and mild inventory, right?
Okay.
So if you were engaging with one of my clients, and we know that what they're going to tell you might not always match what I see in the background, right? So
Ah,
you might
interesting.
be escaping from them, which is why they're engaging with you.
Right,
Okay. So there might be things that hum along in the background that they're not as touched on as they were 3 years ago, right?
right.
So what are the top 5 things I could tell you about the workings of a company that an owner might not tell you?
Ooh, boy, that's a great
That's a
question.
loaded one.
Right. Yeah, that is a loaded question. Okay. Uh, so on the financial side, first thing I would talk about is how's their receivables and payables process, right? Is there a process, right? How's their pricing model? Like, again, who's doing the pricing? Do they have a process? So a lot of it would be process driven, right? Decision making within the organization. Like, do you see as an external or somewhat closer, right? What do you see in terms of are they relying on the people they already have in place if they have people in place? Because a lot of times business owners misunderstand their role, which is, in my opinion, and I think experience, to really be effective, setting the vision and then hiring the good people who know what they're doing. And then this ties into the delegation thing that Lori alluded to. How well are they delegating, right? Is it I've hired a marketing person and I'm paying them, good money, and I'm going to tell them exactly how to market the business as the owner, or am I telling them what I want to achieve? And because I've hired somebody presumably who knows what they're doing, giving them the responsibility for doing that, right? How are they working with you? Are they, are they getting your input? So that's, I think, four. Um, the last one would again tie to HR. What kind of process do they have for talent building and bringing that into the organization? Do they have any process, right? Are they, once they have a strategy and a goal, are they looking at that piece? Who are the players we need to bring in? How do we define a role for them? And are we hiring them with any kind of formality? Because again, HR tends to be the ugly stepchild in a lot of organizations. And when I've been teaching management, we talk about strategic HR. If the HR person's not reporting directly to the owner, then it's not really a strategic imperative, and it needs to be. So that's just off the top of my head stuff that I would look at.
No, and that's so cool. And that's exactly what keeps players playing small, right? When their bookkeeper is writing them templates for letter of offer because they refuse, and I'm like, please use a letter of offer, so when you're stuck, yeah, that's what's keeping small, small,
Yeah,
right? Think ahead,
right.
go more, right? So yeah, that's kind of what I expect. And it's why like some of my clients are nowhere near getting to the level they might want it to
Right.
engage with somebody who can work like you in their business,
Yeah.
but they're nowhere near it because they can't get through the gravel.
Yes, exactly.
I
Exactly.
Mhm.
like I like the way you phrase that, Sarah, on are they keeping small small? And the
Yeah.
reason that, are they thinking small instead of thinking big picture and where they can go, where they can grow, or where they can just be better? Because not every business, as Jeffrey said, not every business wants to grow, go right across the country or, dominate the marketplace. They just want to be the best that they can be within the market share that they have. And your conversation makes me think about that domino impact, working in the client's best interest. Dan in the room would appreciate that too. I mean, we all want to work in the client's best interest, but if the client is bleeding because they don't have a fractional CFO at the table, or they're not getting through the gravel, as you say, Sarah, then we all lose. We all lose, and none of us can work in the client's best interest because we're stymied by the fact that there isn't a process, there isn't a playbook, they're not accessing the information correctly and understanding their why and their how to get there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think like, and bookkeepers, because we're kind of like boots on the ground, right? Because we will nudge them all the time, where an accountant only sees them once a year. And when they get to a point that they're working with a CFO, it's like, cool, okay, so then there's more touch points. But in the beginning, it's kind of bookkeepers, bankers, kind of those people that have more touch points with them going, have you considered this process? And we have to keep telling them. So yeah, it's interesting. So I can see in my client set who's ready and who wants it and is nowhere near ready, right?
Well,
So
and that brings to mind, Jeff, what would be the nice key that people can use when they want to refer business to you? For anybody who has joined us here today, what's a key phrase that they can talk to their clients so that we're all working in the client's best interest, all understanding our role as we encapsulate each client. And, when they're working with the best, they will be the best, right? That's why we call it best in class benefits,
Right.
is because you want to work with the best people to do that. So, what would be a nice key that everybody can take away to say, okay, well, this is how I'm going to introduce Jeffrey to my favorite clients?
Ooh, boy, good question. That's like my elevator pitch,
I'm
right?
gonna I'm gonna blame Sarah for that. She made me think of it.
There you go. Um, I would again, I'd like to tie it back to value, right? Are you confident that you're creating the value you need and that you're going to be able to extract that value when you need it, right? That would be one thing, right? Because it all comes down to value. And again, everybody has a long-term plan to stay in their business. As we know, as those of us that are in the exit planning world, sometimes the vision is to stay there forever. Um, that's not going to happen. Best case scenario, they get to control that exit. Worst case scenario, which happens all too often, is that they are forced by circumstance into having to do that much earlier. And again, it's like the more saleable. I have a book on my shelf called "Your Baby Is Ugly," and it's basically this idea
I
that you know
don't know.
to a buyer, or even internal staff. Again, that's another thing, right? Lots of owners think their staff is going to, and I've heard this many times when I was doing a lot of exit work, internal exit work. Oh, I'm sure the staff are going to buy it because we had a conversation on the water cooler, 2 years ago that they'd all step in. But when you start talking to them about the realities of being a business owner, and you haven't built that pyramid of management, and there's this huge gap, they don't 9 times out of 10, those employees do not step in to buy because, first of all, they've seen the owner, what they've been through, and then there's just too much of a gap, and they don't understand what it is. So again, if you don't create that, the value is really hard to extract. And the worst thing is to work 25, 30 years. And yeah, maybe you're putting good money in your pocket, but at the end of the day, then it's not really worth what it could be, right? And nobody wants to go with that regret.
No, and I have to say, before I did my CEPA, the Certified Exit Planning, my exit plan was die at my desk. I'm gonna be a happy camper. I'm gonna die at my desk, and but then again, when I got into business, really good mentors said, "Don't get into business if you don't know how to get out."
Right.
Right?
Yes,
How
absolutely.
do those two things align that when you get midway through your career, you go, okay, well, this is my identity. This is what I love to do. This is where, take me out in the box, out of my office kind of thing. Thanks for adding that book into the chat, Lisa. So Lisa had added in, My Baby is Ugly, and where you can find that book. Any other questions that we can have while we have Jeffrey on the spot here? If not, we're just going to assume that
Dan looks
everybody
like he's
knows
got a question.
everything.
No.
No.
Well, here I'm going to put in the chat my email, and if anybody would like, just send me a quick email, and I'll send you a copy of a delegation ebook I wrote a couple of years ago, and it comes with it's got a work template. So again, it's not very long, but it's really focused on it. It's not a book in the terms of the theory of delegation. It's really a workbook. It's like, here's the 5 steps, boom, 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 do this. You can give this to your person you're delegating to, how you make the decision. And so again, because that's part of that roadmap of how do I go from stymied to I don't know what's going on to, I cannot possibly do it all myself. And even with the CFO coming in and helping to develop more understanding, the owner still has to be willing to start shedding some of that responsibility, and delegate it. I used to say delegation and abdication are not the same thing. A lot of people just in a panic will throw stuff at someone. Here, you do this because and that's not very effective. So it is a great tool, and I'd be happy to send you guys a copy of it.
Oh, that would be much appreciated, Jeff, for sure. I remember my first assistant. I said, here's when we were still paper and pen. Here's the paper. In order for you to do it, you're gonna have to like pull it out of my hands and take on that job. That is not delegation. That is
No.
not effective. It's so we learn a lot from that point onward, I hope.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for today. It has been wonderful and enlightening, which is what I want. I want us all to grow and learn and share. And we at MP Benefits value our partnerships with the experts in the industry. And we're just really fortunate to count Jeffrey as one of our excellent associates that, again, if we're all working in the best interest of our clients, which we hope we are, is we want to make sure that we're having the best experts be part of everybody's journey. So thanks so much for everybody for coming in today, and most especially to you, Jeffrey, for sharing out your wisdom and your knowledge and the how-tos.
Well, Lori, thank you very much for putting this together and hosting, and thanks everyone for attending. And you've got my email address. Any questions or any feedback, very welcome. And I think some of you we've corresponded, and a few not yet, but I hope to. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. And again, Lori, thanks so much for putting this together. I literally mentioned it to her in passing at a Bean meeting, and next thing I knew, she had the Zoom set up, and we were doing it. So uh, yeah,
Execution. Execution.
execution is
All right.
phenomenal.
Thanks so
Awesome.
much. Have
All
a
right.
great day, everybody, and thanks again.
Thank you.